Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about racial designations over time, particularly as it relates to the U.S. federal census. Now, this is going to be of specific importance to those of you with Native American and African American ancestry, but those of you with Asian ancestry, Mexican ancestry, even those of you with white ancestry are going to find some of this information very useful for you as you do your census research. So we're going to look at, again, the racial designations over time according to the U.S. federal census. We're just going to go census by census from 1850 through 1940, and then I'll wrap up by talking about what that means for you and your research. So let's dive in. We're going to start with the 1850 U.S. federal census. That's the first census where the census enumerators were given instructions specifically about race, where there was a place to record that information. The instructions were really basic. You can see here on the screen. If they were white, they were to leave that field blank. If they were black, they were to put a B. And if they were mulatto, they were to put an MU. By 1860, they simply added one designation, which was IND for Indian, understood to be Native American. In 1870, there was a clarification added, and this is where we start to see some interesting cultural biases come into the U.S. federal census. The clarification added in 1870 was that if the individual had any perceptible trace of African blood, they were to be listed as mulatto. Now, of course, historically, we know that this is immediately following the end of the Civil War and emancipation of the slaves. And so what we see here is that the 1870 census is the first time that all African Americans living in the United States were enumerated by name in the census. And so this racial designation becomes important. But again, we also start to see, like I said, some of those cultural biases come in. So they're listed as black if they are black, but they are listed as mulatto if there is, as it quotes, any perceptible trace of African blood. In the 1880 census, we get no new instructions. So the instructions are exactly the same as previous. We know that the 1890 census was destroyed in a fire, and so I did not include those enumerator instructions. But in 1900, we start to see some changes or some additions of some new racial designations recognized. So now, instead of just leaving it blank, they're instructed that they have to fill in that field. So W is for white, B is for black, and it specifically states Negro or of Negro descent. Okay, so they're not differentiating here anymore technically between black or mulatto, so the degrees of Negro blood. CH for Chinese, JP for Japanese, and still IN for Indian. So those are the only options that the census takers were given. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 designations, which is really kind of limited, but that was, again, the culture of the time. The 1910 census, they actually recognized the need for an other category. So they added an other category, which is going to be designated by the initials in that race field of OT. They gave some clarification in the 1910 census also about African Americans, and this is a direct quote from the census enumerator instructions. It says, black includes all persons who are evidently full-blooded Negroes, while the term mulatto includes all other persons having some proportion or perceptible trace of Negro blood. Now, this is really interesting when you consider that in the 1900 census, there wasn't even a classification given for mulatto. But what we see in the census, and we'll look at some examples here in a minute, what we see is that some census takers continued to use the designation of mulatto. And so they just allowed them or clarified exactly what that meant in the 1910 census, even though it wasn't technically one of the options in 1900. Now in 1920, we add some additional racial designations, particularly additional Asian designations, FIL for Filipino, HIN for Hindu, KOR for Korean. And then there's a clarification given that I find fascinating, which is for other. So for that OT or other category, they were specifically instructed to write the race in the left margin. So if this person does not fit within one of the designated racial or one of the categorized racial designations, they're to write OT for other, but then they're to actually write out the name of the race in the left margin. I went looking for some of these and actually wasn't able to find any. So I would love to see if you have any examples of that, what kinds of things are being written in there, what other races are designated here in the United States in 1920. Now, the 1930 census instructions start to get really wordy, and then 1940 even more so. But we start to see, again, some really, we continue to see some racial designations, particularly around African Americans and Native Americans, that are a little disheartening in view of, in today's light, but are very telling about the times. So here is the clarification given for the 1930 census enumerators. A person of mixed white and Negro blood should be returned as Negro, no matter how small the percentage of Negro blood. So we start to see that one drop rule applying even in federal census designations. Both black and mulatto persons are to be returned as Negroes without distinction. A person of mixed Indian and Negro blood should be returned as Negro unless the Indian blood predominates and the status as an Indian is generally accepted in the community. So we're starting to see, we see here in the census enumerator instructions, this classification based on that one drop rule, whereas if they have any perceptible Negro blood, no matter how small the percentage, we're not going to designate between black and mulatto. We're just going to lump them all into that single bucket. And then the one qualifier there is Indian and Negro mix. If the person is known as an Indian or a Native American in their community, they can be listed as that. Really interesting instructions. We get some more interesting instructions in 1940. Again, no new rules, just some clarifications of the existing instructions so that the census takers can make some of these designations. The first one has to do with Mexicans. Mexicans are to be regarded as white unless definitely Indian or another non-white race. So Mexicans typically are, genetically, they're typically a mix of native or indigenous people and Europeans, and so technically they're Caucasian, and that shows up here in the 1940 census. Mexicans are to be regarded as white unless definitely Indian or another race. So if they look more native or indigenous, or if they have mixed with another non-white race, they're to be marked as that. Can you see how these instructions can be super ambiguous, right? And also, the census taker's own bias might come into play here, or the community bias or the cultural bias of the time comes into play with how these instructions are interpreted and then applied to the U.S. Census. The next clarification from the 1940 census reads, a person of mixed white and Indian blood should be returned as Indian if enrolled on an Indian reservation agency or reservation roll, or if not so enrolled, if the proportion of Indian blood is 1/4 or more, or if the person is regarded as an Indian in the community where he lives. So, if you're mixed white and Indian, you are Indian if you are living on a reservation or enrolled on a roll, or if you are 1/4 or more, and apparently you probably need to know that, or if your community regards you as an Indian or as a Native American. So, again, really ambiguous, left up to a room for a lot of interpretation, a lot of misuse, and that means that you could have Native American ancestors who are listed as white. You could have an ancestor who you presumed was white, who, if they were listed on an Indian roll, so there were some white people who had married into the Indian nations who were listed on tribal rolls, who could then be listed as Indian as their racial designation, even though they were white, because they're listed on a roll. So do you see how these things start to get really mixed up? The final clarification on the 1940 census enumerator instructions is this: any mixture of white and non-white should be reported according to the non-white parent. Mixtures of non-white races should be reported according to the race of the father, except that Negro Indian should be reported as Negro. So, if a white and a non-white mix, then the non-white parent is the one who is the racial designation the child takes. If you have two non-white races that mix, the racial designation is that of the father, unless that non-white mix is a Negro and an Indian, in which case that person is reported as Negro. So once again, we end up with these instructions that tell something about the cultural bias of the time, about the perceptions and the attitudes of the time. Now, let me just share with you a couple of interesting things you can do on Ancestry to see some of these things start to happen a little bit. On the search form, you do have a field for race or nationality. So I can come in here, excuse me. I can come in here and under race, I can put Negro, I can mark that exact, and I can click search with no other information entered. And I'm going to filter these search results or sort these search results by category, filter down just to the census, okay? And here's what I get, right? I get the 1850 through 1940 census. And let me make this a little bit bigger so that you can see it, because I think this is really interesting. In 1850, there were only 44 people listed on the census as Negro. Well, remember, that's because the 1850 census instructed them to be listed as Black, as did 1860, 1870, 1880, 1900. Okay, so all of those, the instruction was to list them as Black, but we still do have some people listed as Negro. In 1920, we have 30,000 people listed as Negro on the U.S. federal census, but then in 1930, that jumps to 11.7 million. And it's not because all of a sudden we had an influx of African Americans in this country. It's because the way that the instructions were written to the census taker changed. And so now, everyone, whether, regardless of how African American they are, is being listed as Negro on the census. And so that's why we see a big jump there. Now you can do that with any number of races. African American races are the ones where the differences are the most prevalent. So I can search for a racial designation of Black. You're going to see here some of those numbers that come up about how people are designated. I can do a search for mulatto, and you're going to see the big dip here. You're going to see some of the designations there as they change over time. So it's really interesting, again, how the census takers interpreted the instructions and how some of them just flat out didn't follow the instructions, which you also will see. So what does this mean for you as a genealogy researcher? Okay, a few things you just need to be aware of as you are researching your ancestry, particularly those of you with African American and Native American ancestry. The first thing you need to be aware of is that racial designations, like most information on the U.S. federal census from 1850 to 1940, is not self-reported. So this information, we don't know who gave the census taker the information about the names and the ages and the birthplaces, but the racial information, the person wouldn't say, oh, I'm Black or I'm Native American. They wouldn't say anything. The census taker would just write down the race based on his perceptions and based on his understanding or interpretation of the instructions that he'd been given. That means that a lot of this information we're seeing in this racial column on the census is based on cultural and community and census taker bias. It's not always going to be accurate based on your perception of your ancestors or even their self-perception of themselves. It also means that it's not going to be consistent from one census to the next. So you need to be aware of that. You could have somebody listed as Black on one census and mulatto on the next census and even white on the next census, and then we're back to mulatto or listed as Negro. You could have somebody listed as Black and then Indian and then mulatto. Again, it depends on how those instructions were interpreted and how the instructions changed over time. So use, just like anything on a census, use that information as a clue. Use it, use it judiciously. Don't disregard it entirely, but also don't hang your hat entirely on it. Just because you know that your ancestor was mulatto or part Black and part Indian doesn't mean that that's not your ancestor just because they're listed as Negro on the census. Vice versa is also true. Just because you know your ancestor was Native American or even African American, don't discount that that's your person if they're listed as white on the census. Because of some of the cultural and community biases of the time, a lot of people with lighter skin would pass if they could. They would pass as white in their communities. And so there may have been very few people who actually knew that they had African American or Native American blood. The cool thing is that now we're starting to see some scientific proof of some of that information. As we take an Ancestry DNA test, we start to see just exactly what that ethnic breakdown is, what percentage of European versus Asian versus African blood that we might have. And those of us who, thought we were 100% European or thought we were, 100% African are starting to see that that's not really the case. There are very few people who are pure 100% anything. And what that also means is that I, as a 100% European person with a few random percentages of other things, as a mostly European person, I have African American cousins. And they show up on my DNA match list, and I'm not going to discount them just because I'm almost entirely European. And I would hope that they wouldn't discount me even if they were mostly African, because people mixed a lot more than we thought they did. And those census enumerator instructions reflect that. They reflect that we knew that people were mixing for a long time, and those things are starting to come out now. So hopefully that's given you some information to work with your census results, to work with finding your ancestors. Recognize that you can use that race field, but don't rely on it 100% because those racial designations have changed over time. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.